Our next panel is going to be looking at that groundwater, surface water interaction. I'd like to invite them up to the stage. Moderating that panel, we have John Dupnik, the Deputy Executive Administrator for the Texas Water Development Board in water science and conservation. He's also a familiar face to many of you and part of the Texas groundwater community, having served as General Manager of the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District. I'm going to let him introduce our panelists. Let's give them a nice welcome.
Can you hear me? Okay, there it is. All right. Well, thanks, first of all, everyone, for being here today to talk about this tricky topic of surface water groundwater interaction. And we've got that provocative byline in there of where do you draw the line? Just to allude to the fact that we've got a very interesting institutional and legal framework that applies to Texas, and where we've created this distinction between the two waters. And so we've got a great panel of folks up here today to talk about it. And one of the things that is pretty apparent about this problem is that we created this distinction, even though we all recognize that the hydrologic cycle exists. It's real. We recognize that. We learned it in grade school. But it's an issue that deserves some attention. And so we're here to talk about it. We've got this great panel. I'm going to start by introducing these folks. So we're going to start on the end. We got Dr. Joe Yelderman, professor with the University of Baylor, specifically focuses research on hydrogeology, and specifically on, you're looking closely at projects looking at the interaction of surface water and groundwater. Got Mr. Beach down here, been in the consulting world for a number of years. I looked at his resume. I'm not even going to try to talk about the number of projects he's been involved with. But a licensed professional geoscientist, hydrogeologist with LBG Guyton for a number of years, and now WSP, is that correct? Okay. And James Kovas, he's a licensed engineer in Texas, and been involved with water policy for a number of years, going all the way back to his tenure with TNRCC, back when it was called TNRCC, which I was there too, James, we're dating ourselves just a little bit. And so he's been involved with water policy since then, where he's involved with water rights adjudication issues and the water rights program at TNRCC. And then more recently at LCRA, where he tackled a problem that was slightly contentious, I guess you would say, developing the water management plan for LCRA. And then he's retired since then. He's in private consulting. And one pattern I've noticed is, James, you keep trying to retire, and we keep dragging you back into this. So we appreciate you being here. And then Dave Mauk, to my immediate right here, he's the general manager of the Bandera County River Authority and Groundwater Conservation District. Provides a very interesting perspective because it's one of those unique districts that gets to manage both. Looks at groundwater, looks at surface water, so he's going to offer his perspective from what it's like to be a resource manager responsible for both of those waters. I think the more interesting component of his biography, and if you haven't read it, look at it. Before he got to Texas, he spent 14 years as a bail bondsman and a bounty hunter in Baltimore, Maryland. Is that right, Dave? Yeah, and I'm sure those, I can only imagine those skills have served you very well in this current position. Yeah. So also in his biography, he said he quickly got to Texas as fast as he could, and now he manages that district and does a very good job, but does offer that very unique perspective. So that sets up the issue. It is a very difficult issue, and just by the very nature of the byline of how we've set up this panel, it does allude to the fact that we've created this distinction, this legal distinction in Texas between groundwater and surface water. And so not only, as I mentioned, did we learn in grade school that the hydrologic cycle exists, we understand, I don't think anybody believes that those are truly separate systems. We understand fundamentally that these are very connected systems. And in fact, we've done work to sort of quantify that and inform that. And I'll start by plugging our agency's work. One of the reports that we were directed by the legislature to do back in 2015, we conducted what was called the Texas Aquifer Study. And effectively what the conclusions were is that 30% of all surface water is attributed to groundwater. In other words, any aquifer that has outcrop with a stream crossing over it is going to be receiving some contribution from groundwater. So these are interconnected systems. Legally, we treat them differently, but as a practical matter, we need to manage them holistically. So what we're going to do here today on the panel is we're going to present sort of an overview of to provide some context from a technical perspective. And so we got Dr. Yelderman and James Beach down there to offer up that perspective. Then we also have, we need to look at it from an institutional and legal perspective. And so James Kovas and Dave Mauk will provide that perspective as well. So we'll kick off with an overview of things, and Dr. Yelderman is going to give us a short PowerPoint to present some of the technical aspects.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with this diagram, which I think almost every conversation about groundwater-surface water interaction introduces, a gaining stream and a losing stream. But what I want to point out is that this diagram is extremely simple and it's designed to get across a conceptual standpoint. I use it in my classes, it's great, but it doesn't leave you with a real image of reality, it just gets across an idea. One thing that you notice on here is that everything is homogeneous. The sand is all the same in the aquifer. Another thing you notice is that it's not to scale. The river's like 1/3 of the entire alluvial aquifer because it's just a piece that's shown in this block diagram. And there's no boundaries. In other words, there's no lateral extent or vertical extent of where the aquifer stops. And then finally, those arrows showing directions don't have any rates with them. And so people don't have really any idea how fast things are really flowing. And so I want to look at the reality. This is a picture of reality. And on the left, you see a picture of the Brazos River meandering around a bend. And if you were to drill a well in the center of that, you would have about a 5-foot section of aquifer as shown in the cross section on the right. And if you drill closer to the river, you'll have about a 20-foot section of aquifer. And so if you drill one well in there and then extrapolate from that, you will be really misrepresented. And interesting enough, if you look at the existing wells in an alluvial aquifer like this, all the ones that drilled really shallow, poor wells are abandoned, and the really good wells still exist. And so you get a biased view sometimes of how important that aquifer may be. So I want to move second to another problem here, and that is that there's connections to it, the river, yes, but it's not connected everywhere. It's not connected the same everywhere. So we took a little boat trip down the river to show my students just exactly how this works. And you go down the river and the banks are all clay and it's not well connected. It's very poorly connected. In fact, it's connected the same way sometimes landfills are connected to aquifers. There's clay between them and the aquifer. So it's blocked. And other workers have shown this. I know Gretchen Miller talked yesterday, Peter Knappett, and she had been working down there, and they have shown that aquifer is not real well connected in that particular zone as well. On top of that, we did see some places where there was gravel right at the riverbank level, and we were able to see a really good connection. And then finally, as the diagram shown on the right, the little cartoon there, we found places where the river actually cut into the shale bedrock below it to where it was disconnected from the aquifer, and certainly things on one side of the river could not connect to the other. This is not everywhere. There are places where there's not shale or confining layers underneath the river, but there's other aquifers. The river's flowing on top of a bedrock aquifer and connected with that. So those are some things that we look at. So this last one, I'm going to talk about those little arrows that didn't have any flow rates with them. And I know this is kind of hard to see because the lines are kind of thin, but this is a cross-section of some wells adjacent to the Brazos River that happened this past year. And that blue line on the bottom is the flow to the river. And that groundwater has a very gentle slope, a very flat slope, so it's moving extremely slow, and it's seeping into the river. But the river then rose much higher than the groundwater and started to flow back the other direction into the aquifer. That lasted for 37 days. And if you can see that little gray area, that's as far as it got. We estimated about 88 feet into the aquifer. And that closest well did not change chemistry. Even though the water flowed back that direction, it didn't go very far. And then when the river dropped back down, it reversed and flowed back to the river again. In the meantime, the wells back behind that, away from the river, their water couldn't go to the river anymore, so they slowly began to rise. And so that wasn't water coming from the river, that was groundwater that was blocked from going to the river. And so when you look at the dynamics of this, let me just explain to you that the rate of flow in that groundwater is so slow, it often takes more than 100 years to go from one edge of the aquifer to the river. And we see water flowing in the river, and it goes as far in just a few hours as that water's going to go in the aquifer for a year. So it's a very different dynamic. So I think some of the challenges we're going to have is with looking at the heterogeneity as we look at this. And I'm going to leave this slide kind of as a focus slide for us to talk or relate to as we talk. This is a real cross-section with real data, and what you see is the Brazos River on the right, which is a gaining stream in this case, and a tributary in the middle of the slide, which is a losing stream. So we have both a losing and a gaining stream. Groundwater is, surface water is going into groundwater, groundwater is going into surface water. So which one is taking water from the other? Well, neither. They're connected, but they're connected differently. They aren't the same kinds of waters. They're often different chemically. They flow at different rates. And although they're connected and we need to manage them conjunctively, I challenge you that we still need to manage them differently. And I'll stop there.
All right. And James Beach, so can you, Dr. Yelderman described these are highly complex systems and they behave differently depending on conditions. Can you talk a little bit about the current tools we have available to look at these things and give your overall perspective of where we are technically with understanding how these systems work?
Yeah. So glad Dr. Joe led off, number one, because he's a professor and he has more credibility than I do as a consultant. So anyway, he described very well. I could just say ditto and pass the mic on. But I think one of the things that we see in these systems all the time, when we go to Groundwater District meetings, when we interact with the public, people ask questions like, well, how does groundwater and surface water interact? And sometimes it's kind of like a deer in the headlights when you realize, okay, all these people are up here talking about this complex, situation that Dr. Joe just described and that we talk about, and and we're asking for a very simple answer to a very complex question. And so I think one of the things that we tend to do, just to kind of back up and confirm what Joe was saying, is that we look at systems that we understand fairly well. For instance, the San Antonio segment of the Edwards and its connection to the Comal Springs, the Barton Springs Edwards section and its connection to spring flow and all of the history and the science that's been developed there. And we want to take those examples and we want to apply that in other places where it's not that well understood or that simple. And so, and then we want to take a spot where we've studied well somewhere else in the state, and we have some answers from that location. For instance, the example you just brought up, and we want to say, okay, well that's how it's gonna behave 1 mile up the river, or 1 mile down the river, or 20 miles down the river, or up and down the whole Brazos River. It's going to look like one cross section that Joe studied very well. And that's the difficult part about this, is that variability and the complexity of it is a little bit overwhelming. That doesn't mean we can't make progress. When they walked up on the Edwards in San Antonio and started looking at Comal, they had the same questions. They started studying. They started applying science and said, hey, what can we learn about this? And it's much more well understood now. So, some of the recent projects that we've seen trying to address this issue, some drilling out, on the Colorado River, just reinforces this. You go out, you drill a well, and you're expecting alluvium because that's what the map shows, or that's what everybody says, and lo and behold, you don't even find any alluvium. And so you go to the next spot and you go, okay, let's build a conceptual model about alluvium and how groundwater interacts here, and let's see what we can learn there, which then, of course, you have to ask the question, sort of like Dr. Joe just illustrated, well, what do we do with this other site where there wasn't even any alluvium? And so it's a similar paradox that we have with estimating recharge. A lot of times in our detailed research, we look at, we'll take a spot the size of this room or half the size of this room, and we'll instrument it. We will do intensive studies year after year after year, and we'll look at recharge on that spot. and we'll do all kind of geochemistry and isotopes and flow studies and modeling and all of this stuff. And at the end of that, we have a much better understanding of what's happening right there at that site. And then we try to apply that across a large regional area in an outcrop that's, literally millions of times bigger. And you go, okay, well, how applicable is that? And so that's sort of the challenge that we're defining here. And so, we'll talk in a little bit about the tools that we have to try to move from these complex systems and, the horsepower that we have to actually move from a conceptual model to a numerical model where we try to quantify answers for decision makers like districts and state agencies and lawyers. And so we try to quantify those things, and we'll talk in a little more detail about that. But sort of the foundation of understanding how hard that is to just sort of acknowledge first this uncertainty and the complexity of the systems. Thanks.
So what I'm picking up from a technical perspective is complicated. That's a good summary of it. So good thing is, from an institutional perspective, I think it's much more clear and much more easy to figure out, right? James, is that? So can you take just a second to describe just legally sort of the framework in terms of how we look at surface water and groundwater differently?
I would concur. It is complicated, yes. In regard to the historically, not a whole lot has been done from a regulatory perspective and from the standpoint of passing laws and so forth. The first time it shows up really is in '97. Senate Bill 1 was being discussed, and Lieutenant Governor came to TNRCC and said, identify an issue that we need to address that's going to be here in the future. And we identified surface water and groundwater interaction and how the TNRCC, the state agencies, and groundwater districts needed to address this issue. And he said, well, let's get something in the bill about that. And so some language was proposed, both from a groundwater district perspective and a surface water regulatory perspective. The only thing that made it through in Senate Bill 1 was some language into Chapter 11 that clearly stated that the agency had to take into consideration the effects on groundwater and groundwater recharge as a part of its permitting process. It didn't show up until later in relation to groundwater conservation districts in regard to the planning process and how that needed to show up in regard to addressing the interaction between groundwater and surface water. Basically, there's been a reluctance in the statutes to deal with this specifically, probably because it's being regulated by two different arms, the groundwater districts and the state agency. But it needs to be addressed more specifically. As you've heard and seen in some of the examples, it's not homogeneous, it's very complex. As James said, you can be sitting in one situation, move 1,000 yards up or down the river, and it could change specifically. That's been my experience, and from the regulatory side, when we've had a case-by-case sort of situation we had to deal with, we had to go out and deal with it specifically in that set of circumstances. We could not apply any kind of general standard and it work. Matter of fact, a couple of cases, the Pecos River case, where Texas sued New Mexico, really was about groundwater development in New Mexico, capturing the water of the Pecos River before it got to Texas. That's now also the center of the case in regard to Texas versus New Mexico and the Rio Grande. The same sort of situation where surface water is getting captured before it gets to the state line because of groundwater wells being drilled into the alluvium and capturing that water. That was the assertion in the Pecos case, and eventually the Supreme Court found that that was true, and New Mexico had to compensate for that. And that the Rio Grande case is now still pending in regard to that. When you look out further, past 30 to 40 years, my time frame, and working with other Western states, a lot of the other Western states have had to deal with this issue. They've been addressing this. A lot of the states have regulation over surface water and groundwater, but they've also had to face this issue of groundwater wells being located in such a way that it is capturing surface water. And they've had to address those issues and develop laws and regulations in association with it. In my experience, it's a case where, from a regulatory perspective, you know that there's an interaction going on in certain cases, or you find that there's evidence of that. But you've got to take it a step further in regard to it, because the real issue is if there is an interaction and there is water being taken from a groundwater well, and you can prove that there is surface water in that well coming out in the discharge. The second question is really, okay, how much of that is groundwater and how much of that is surface water? Because the ultimate test is going to be, if there is surface water coming out there, you've got to quantify that so as the well owner has the opportunity to go then purchase or obtain the necessary water rights to cover that portion of it. And so that's been a lot of the issue associated with it. And so that's sort of kind of, I'll end there, and I think that's some of the big issues that have been cropped up, especially on the regulatory side.
So Dave, I mentioned your district's kind of a rare bird. It's a combination groundwater conservation district and a river authority. So you've got, at least within your county, the framework to manage the two holistically, but still you've got this legal distinction between the two. So you can just talk generally about how that affects your district from a resource management perspective and what sort of challenges that presents?
Yeah, I'm going to take this a little different turn than the rest. They're scientists, I'm a bureaucrat. And one of the things I think we got to really realize...
And a bounty hunter.
You know, one of the things we see it constantly, is problems with surface water. Any entity that deals with surface water and groundwater are going to have to deal with several things. One, with surface water, and this is outside the interaction, you're going to have to deal with things like the bed and banks. Who owns this? You're going to have to deal with navigable versus non-navigable streams. As the Groundwater Conservation District, you're going to have to deal with what James was just talking about. Do you have groundwater wells under the influence of surface water? And why is this something that we see all the time? Property rights. And we have a host of agencies involved in this. You've got Sheriff's Department, constables, game wardens, TCQ, Watermaster, us, Groundwater Conservation Districts, because it becomes literally a property rights clash. We've got landowners who are on surface water in front of their land that believe their rights are being trampled because people in the public who have a right to get to that surface water, the two are clashing quite a bit. We see it all the time, and it's not an easy thing to mitigate and to mediate. It's not a real clear answer with the property right issues. And then you get into the property rights of the groundwater wells. And you get into the people have the right to capture, but then you have these wells that are potentially under the influence of surface water. And the passions and emotions that come out on both sides of these are intense, and you can actually see the arguments on both sides. And I don't know what the answer is. They've had hearings out in West Texas, San Saba, and you hear ranchers come up there on both sides, and it's an emotional, passionate, and a very hard institutional and regulatory pathway to go through. And that's one of the things that anytime you deal with surface water and groundwater, that those two most likely are going to clash.
And so I want to turn it to you, Joe, to talk about some of the technical challenges. Yeah, if you can pass the mic on down. In your comments or your thoughts back to me when we were preparing for the panel, you mentioned that we really need to find a way to fit the science with the legal framework that's in place. One of the interesting legal terms that involves this, that it relates directly to where you draw the line, is this idea of underflow. So from a technical perspective, how can is the science compatible, or is the technical data that we need to really join these things? How do we fit the science with this concept of underflow? Do those concepts work together? How can then science inform where you in fact draw the line and what that is? How do we define this?
Thank you for that question, John. Yeah, but I'm going to do like a lot of panelists do. I'm going to back up just 1 second. If you notice, this conversation talked a lot about, groundwater affecting surface water. I want to point out that surface water affects groundwater. No one talks about the fact that we dammed up the rivers and lowered the water level in the river and drained the aquifer more, decreasing the groundwater in the aquifer. It goes both ways. And so we have taken water out of the rivers and lowered the groundwater, just like we've taken water out of the aquifer and lowered the river or decreased the flow in the river. It goes both ways. It's not a one-way system. That's important for us to understand and to manage in the future. The second one is the dynamics. What you do in the river has immediate impact to the groundwater. It dams it up or drains it. What you do in the groundwater may or may not have an immediate impact, but has a long-range impact. So when you do pumping for a long period of time, that has a cumulative impact. So we've got a dynamic that we've got to work with there. With the term to underflow, which I think is a good thing to think about, and bring up one of my favorite words, and I say that sarcastically, the hyporeic zone, if any of y'all are familiar with that term, is this interaction between groundwater and surface water near the channel. And underflow is really just that material that's in the channel that is actually connected with the river and flowing in the same direction, basically, that the river is. In some of our smaller streams, the alluvial water is flowing subparallel to the river, so it's almost like the river water. But in our larger ones, alluvial aquifers, it's flowing more perpendicular to the river, and in doing that, it's not really part of the river system or underflow at all. And so it's an aquifer, and it's getting rainwater. It's a separate aquifer. It's not getting river water. Okay, that's the way it works. It may in a big flood, but that's rare occasion. We looked at it isotopically and chemically. It's different. And so that's a key issue. So we have to learn to manage, I think, with that regard. The real key there, I think, is the dynamic, the rate of flow in the two systems, and how we manage that together.
James, I'll kind of present the same question to you, but just more generally. How do we develop the science to fit within this regulatory framework? What's needed? What's the biggest impediment to providing the technical tools to really better inform how we manage those two, or how we treat those two different types of water?
Yeah, so, as a scientist, I'm always going to say more data, right? Sound like John Mayer up here. More data is always better. Y'all are tired of that answer, but it really is true to some degree. Dr. Joe talked about, the spatial scale that we're dealing with, when you start trying to take a regional GAM, a planning level model, and in every scope of work, for developing a GAM, there is, address streams and stream aquifer interaction, and so we take a stab at that from a very regional perspective, and that is incorporated, but immediately you understand you don't have the right scale to look at the complexity of the issues that Dr. Joe was just talking about, right? We've got big grid blocks, and we need grid blocks maybe the size of one of those tables out here to really address the complexity that we're talking about. But there's no way we can do that, so we've got that limitation. How do we move forward from there? I think essentially, just like we move forward in every other aspect of science. One day at a time, one study at a time. You try to move forward, and you apply what you learn here to another place if it's appropriate, but you have to be careful doing that. And so obviously, Joe talked about the temporal scale as well. You've got this river passing by quickly and floods coming and going and droughts affecting things, and then you've got a groundwater system that's working at a very different time scale. And they're connected, but the complexity of trying to simulate both of those together to predict some quantitative results for a regulatory body to make decisions is difficult, and there's just data limits, right? And so we've got good tools for planning. It's a little bit different when you start asking very complex questions. And so it's sort of like saying, hey, I need to get from the south side of San Antonio to the north side of San Antonio. One tool would be I could get on my bicycle. The other tool could be I could get in a rocket ship and get there in 2 seconds. I like the rocket ship. I can get there quicker. Well, let's talk about what that really takes. And it's sort of the same way with modeling, right? It's sort of the same way with getting to a good quantitative answer with a particular tool. It takes a certain amount of data. And you realize you're working in an uncertain framework, right? And so scientists and engineers are used to working in uncertain frameworks, probabilistic frameworks. Decision makers don't really like that, and I don't blame them, because you have to have a defensible answer. You have to have an objective answer. You can't say, well, the answer kind of swings from here to there. And if you're building a bridge, you just build in a certain safety factor as an engineer. I'm not an engineer, but that's what they tell me they do, right? And you say, okay, we're going to build in X amount of safety factor. The more safety factor we want in, probably the more expensive the bridge is going to be. Scientists, a little bit more difficult to quantify things that way, but we like to work in, we understand we're working in an uncertain framework, in a probabilistic framework, and yet all of the questions that are asked of us are generally like, well, what's the answer to the third decimal place? And so, this range of answers doesn't fit the regulatory framework and the questions that decision makers need to make. And so that's one of the difficulties, and we'll talk a little bit more about potentially moving forward with that later.
Yeah, so James Kovas, I want to go to you and talk about, so you worked at TNRCC, you've been part of the adjudication of the water rights and how that works. Water availability models are part of that process, but from a state perspective, since the state effectively owns the surface water, and grants the permits for diversions of surface water, what are some of the challenges that the state is dealing with now that we're starting to see increased pressure, increased pumping, effects on surface water streams? How's the state manage this?
Well, it's a difficult situation for them because they have limited resources. The state has not funded a lot of the surface water programs at the TCEQ as they probably should have. Limited funds in relation to that, especially when it comes to this type of issue. My experience there is, as being discussed here today, it takes when you get into the regulatory side and you're going and trying to resolve a matter, you have to get the specifics. You've got to go in and get the specifics. A couple of quick examples. There was one well on the San Marcos River. It was within 40 feet of the bank of the river. It was challenged that this was taking river water. When we did the analysis on it and did some testing, we found out, no, the groundwater was moving perpendicularly to the river, and it was all groundwater. There was no surface water being taken in relation to it. In another case in the Rio Grande, we had a situation where there was a new farming operation came into play. They didn't have the water rights on the Rio Grande, so they went off of the river, put in 11 wells. And when we noticed all of a sudden that the water's being released from one reservoir down there to the other reservoir, from Amistad to Falcon, we found out all of a sudden there was this big decrease in the amount of water that was flowing down the river. We went out and tested the wells. We found 7 of the 11 wells were pumping under the influence of surface water. 4 of them were not. And we found out that 76% of the water under the pumping regime that they had was surface water, and the remainder was groundwater. And so we were able then to quantify it. We were able to sit down with the landowner and demonstrate that all to him and his consultant, and it was well working with their consultant as well, and we got to a resolution in it. But we had to go to that degree to get there. And we had to do a lot of data and testing and analysis to get there in regard to finding out what the true answer was. But it is a true challenge from a regulatory perspective because it's not a one-size-fits-all, not a one-size-fits-all situation.
All right, so let's move on to talking about how we fix this. And we've got a lot of brain power up here. We might just solve it right here today. What do you think, guys? This is a question my chairman frequently asks me. I meet with him on occasion. Is he here, Chairman Lake? Okay, good. What he'll do on occasion is he'll bring me in and he'll say, okay, you're dictator Dupnik, you're king for a day, you've got all the money in the world. What's it going to take to fix this problem? Nothing makes me more nervous than that question. So I'll put that on you guys. what's the solution to this? What's the grand fix? How, we'll start with you, Dave. How, from a resource management perspective, given the context that you provide here, managing both the River Authority and Groundwater District, what would make your life easier? What's needed to really reconcile the difference between how we look at the surface water and groundwater?
Hey, thanks.
Yeah, how's it feel?
Let me do this. Let me show you some examples of what we've done here, and I think it can show how we can build upon these things, some of the things that we've done at our district. A few years back, Texas Water Development Board came to us as a GCD, and they were doing a LiDAR acquisition, and which is mapping, aerial mapping, and giving you really good, accurate elevations, surface elevations. The Groundwater District, we were on board. We partnered with Water Development Board and other people. We wanted that for our monitor well programs. Got it, as a GCD. A few years later, one of my past colleagues, who you all know, Sarah Schlesinger, myself, were actually sitting around talking one day, and we said, we're in Flash Flood Alley, and we're not proactive with floods, we're reactive. So we got with the USGS, and we said, here's a problem. Scope this for us, get a solution. We want a flood warning system, and they did it. We didn't have the money to do it. Fast forward a little bit more, Texas Water Development Board puts a call out to the river authorities. Flood grants. We took that project from USGS, went to the Texas Water Development Board, we got a flood grant for it. That project's being implemented, it's starting Monday, it's state of the art, and it's inevitably gonna save lives. But we couldn't have done that as a river authority without that LiDAR from the GCD, and the GCD could not have got that grant from the river authority. Now we've got this river authority flood early warning system that has high intensity rainfall gauges, and one of them is right at our groundwater monitoring well. So we could start to see the interaction, because that well actually has direct recharge. We could start to see the recharge from that well. And then we have the rain gate just downstream, and we have the river gauges. We can start to see from the recharge, if we're getting any spring flow, how the river's acting, start age dating the spring flow, look for gain loss studies like they had talked about. And these are all coming together because the River Authority got one project, the GCD has another project, and then you can take those science that you're getting from the two and merge them together and start working together. And as a River Authority, we've adopted rules out of Chapter 51 that deal with water quality, and it says water, it doesn't say surface water. So we've developed rules to protect the aquifer and the surface water from illegal dumping, and TCQ routinely refers cases to us where we can quickly mitigate any problem. We can enforce not only the groundwater protection, anything that's hurting the groundwater or anything that's hurting the surface water. The reason we're able to do this, and that's where I think we need to go, is we're under the same roof. I'm not saying everybody needs to be under the same roof, but the advantage we have is communication. I think there's a lot of districts out there that work together right now. Groundwater districts are set really to protect the resource. You've got the river authorities there, and I think overall everybody's got the same idea. But we need to open communication, get programs together, get the entities working together to do best management practices, policies to collectively manage the resource.
All right, let's work down the line, James. Let's go take it back to you, Kovas. So you're king for the day. What, from a regulatory perspective, from a legal perspective, what could help improve our current circumstance?
Probably first thing I would say would be to for the development board to work with GCDs and the TCQ in trying to identify those areas of the state where you do see the potential or where there's existing problems already over the surface and groundwater interaction or groundwater under the influence of surface water scenarios. Identify those areas and then so you can start to develop some data and information in regard to it and put some effort toward getting that information that you're really going to need to make some of these complex decisions on the upfront side, because just applying it across the board is not going to answer the regulatory side of the equation, I don't think, either from a groundwater or a surface water perspective. Secondly, I think you would need to, I would look toward some of the experience that some of the other Western states have done in relation to this issue. They've tackled, I know Idaho has, and other western states, suffering the same situation we are, and that is that there's more and more competition for the resources, whether it's groundwater and or surface water. And so a lot more people in some of the western states are relying on groundwater wells, and they're going into situations where there's groundwater under the influence of surface water, and it's interacting with both, and it's affecting both from a standpoint of economics as well as the resource itself. And so I think they've already kind of looked at some of these things, and I think it'd be good to get their perspective, or at least work with them and find out the do's and don'ts, and what some of their past experiences have been and how they've been able to work through them.
All right, James Beach, technical perspective, we established that this is complicated, highly variable, there's scale issues. From a technical perspective, what can we do to help us understand these systems better?
Yeah, I think every study helps. Every bit of good information that the districts can gather is going to be helpful. I think you need to prioritize data and work with your experts to figure this out. But you need to prioritize the data that you're collecting and make sure that it's going to answer the questions and meet your objectives, right? Because a lot of times we do see that the same type of data is collected year after year after year from the same well. And we don't ever stop and kind of reevaluate monitoring systems, or we're monitoring, streams a certain way or water quality a certain way. And sometimes it pays to back up and go, okay, let's review how we're collecting data, why are we collecting data. It's the same way with the models, I like that Lyle Larson blamed it all on Robert Mace yesterday. I thought that was funny. So anyway, I don't think he blamed it on him, but anyway, he said, see, Dr. Mace. So anyway, but it's the same thing. I mean, 20 years ago when GAM started, the bottom line was we need planning models, and so that's where they started. And now as the questions get more complicated, as James just pointed out, the resource is more limited, more folks understand the high value of water. And so there's going to be harder questions. There's going to be more data that we need to get. And so we need to continue to do that and realize that it is an inch-wise progression forward, and that's okay. And so it's expensive. It takes time. That's okay. And where possible, we need to acknowledge, well, we always need to acknowledge the fact that we live, this is an uncertain system. We don't have all the information. We have limits on what we understand given the data that we have. And so to the degree that we can, we need to use that sort of probabilistic framework. And I understand that that's really difficult for decision makers and districts when you're looking at a permit or, TCEQ, when they're making tough decisions, and when you get into a contested case, those kind of tough decisions, it's really difficult to kind of stay in that mindset. But it is very helpful in the framework that we're looking at least from a scientific standpoint, at least from the standpoint of moving forward and testing different theories and testing different conceptual models before we start jumping into numerical models. And I think that's one of the ways we learn is by learning how we're wrong and learning what's better and moving forward that way. And to, for districts, just real boots on the ground stuff, I think is to remember that, we're adapting all the time. If we're charged to use the best available science, and the best available science, hopefully, if you're getting good information, is changing all the time. And so to the degree you can, try to build in adaptive management into the systems and the decision processes and all of the things that you're required to do. I know it's difficult, it's hard, because, there's a lot of board members are coming to a meeting and they've reviewed the packet and they've got to make a decision, and it's difficult to go, hey, what are all of the variables here, and to really understand the technical issues, they just need an answer. And sometimes, so to stay sort of in a framework where you can go, if the science is changing and we're getting better at this, then we need to also adapt to that and manage that way as best we can without wrecking the whole system, right? So anyway, those are my suggestions.
All right, Dr. Yelderman, you get the final word on this question. How do we fix this?
Let me first of all say I embrace challenging problems. I think that's what I like to do, so I'm all for this. But I think the cooperation, I think the idea that Dave pointed out, groundwater districts and surface water entities working together, they're in a unique, if not a rare situation. But I think we all need to start talking to each other. And I think that's great about groundwater districts. They do have specific responsibility, and so they're doing specific studies with their specific responsibility, which is gathering the kind of data, James, that you're talking about and others have mentioned. I think we need to do a better job of water accounting. I think in the last panel we talked about double counting water in the brackish. I know people that talk about effluent dominated streams where it's all wastewater, especially in the summer coming down the stream. Not exactly true, but when you look at the base flow of the Brazos River where I am, a lot of the discharge where some of the studies I was doing is coming out of the Waco Metropolitan Regional Sewer System, and a big portion of that's coming out of the Trinity Aquifer. And it's being added to the surface water right there, and it's being counted as surface water. So, you know, I think we need to really kind of think about where all our water is coming from, where it's all going, and how we're going to manage that in an effective way for everybody. So there's some great challenges out there, but great opportunity to just learn more. And I want to end with something that probably y'all don't think about, but I find fascinating. So I throw it out there just as something that maybe will get me in trouble. I hope you won't. The bounty hunter won't come get me. That's good material. But I find it fascinating looking at the alluvial aquifers, and that it's illegal by the state to contaminate that groundwater, but that aquifer, but you can remove that aquifer permanently by mining it for aggregate. And aggregate's a great resource too, but you know, it's fascinating to me that you can actually remove the aquifer, because we've seen a great deal of our most productive aquifer has been removed. And just the processes that go on with life around us. So we've got a lot of things that we need to challenge, but I think groundwater districts and local entities are a great way to tackle these problems.
All right, so I think we've got just enough time for a few questions. So if you've got a question, just line up to the mic, and I'll check in with Leah to see if we've got in coming through our technology sources here. Looks like we've got a couple live folks, so let's start with them. Steve, I'm shocked that you've got a question on this topic.
So Chapter 36 mentions that when a permit comes in front of a district for
Can you get a little closer to the microphone, please?
Sure. I don't want to be too loud. Chapter 36 requires that when a district looks to permit or deny a permit, that they need to look at the impact of that pumping and see if there's unreasonable impact on surface water. I just wondered what your definition of unreasonable impact would be on surface water from groundwater pumping.
Dave, that's probably aimed at you. You want to take that one?
Hey, I appreciate this one. Luckily, in my area, I got the Lower Trinity, which, as you know, I got the scientists here. And I don't go anywhere without a hydrogeologist. James over here is on my professional service agreement, so if I don't know the answer, I'm going to look to him. We don't have any real communication between the surface naturally in the Lower Trinity Aquifer. And unfortunately, we don't have quite a bit of interaction between the Middle Trinity there either. A lot of our wells in the Middle Trinity are 480 feet deep. Very rare. I've never seen one of our wells that would have actually impacted the surface water there. It's a good thing for us because we don't have to deal with some of the stuff that you have in other jurisdictions. It's a bad thing for us because when it rains, it's not going to immediately get down into the aquifer, especially not the Lower Trinity. The water down there, we age dated it. It's 20,000 years old. So that issue doesn't come up with us at all. And if it did, that would be something that I would talk to my attorney about and my hydrogeologist over there and get a real good answer and go into the permit hearing.
So I've been repeating internally in my head, John, you're not a panelist, John, you're not a panelist, but I will offer this. There are some districts that manage spring flow, and I think they've decided for themselves that if a permit will affect that DFC, maybe a minimum spring flow requirement, that's a de facto determination of unreasonable impact. So that's one example, Steve, that you might look at. Any other questions from the audience? Leah, do we have any coming in?
I've got a couple, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so the first one goes a little bit to a panel from yesterday. So Chairman Larson proposed this last session an advisory council to study the issue of groundwater surface water interaction. And the question is that the answer, or are there other legislative changes needed to deal with this?
Anyone who wants to tackle that?
It's hot potato.
I mean, I think definitely there needs to probably be some direction from the legislature in regard to this issue. It is starting to crop up, and it's going to continue to crop up across the state. We're seeing it now. We're going to see it more in the future, I think. So it would be best to get ahead of the curve and try to address some of these issues as quickly as you can. It's going to be an evolutionary process. I think to get there, it's not going to happen in one session. It's probably going to take several sessions to do it.
I'm a scientist, not a legislator, but I know I've talked a lot about river and groundwater interaction, but we've developed a lot of reservoirs that are also leaking into our groundwater, sometimes at high flow and other things. We've got lake water and groundwater interaction as well, or reservoir and groundwater interaction as well. So I think it's a complex subject. We definitely need the council, but I think we need a lot more diversity than what we can get with just one panel. So I compliment Congressman Larson, but at the same time, I think we need to get a lot more studies done and a lot more information as we move forward.
Any other questions, Leah?
Yeah, I do have another one that came in, and you guys can probably play hot potato again to see who wants to try to tackle this one. Do river authorities have standing to challenge groundwater permit applications that may impact springs or gaining streams? Should they?
Well, James, I think both you and Dave have some river authority experience.
Should they challenge?
The question is if they have standing to challenge.
In relation to groundwater pumpage?
Permit applications, yeah.
I think some of the river authorities do have some good data in relation to watching the flow of the river, and they have sufficient gauges to show that significant amounts of water are leaving the river in certain segments of their area. And I think that information would be helpful. I think the first step would be to set up a dialogue with the local groundwater district and try to reach some sort of happy medium in trying to address that issue and work collectively and conjunctively to try to put together a package to address that sort of situation is what I think they should do.
Yeah, you nailed it. All right, and then there's one more, and actually, this is also aimed at you, James. You mentioned what other Western states are doing. How do you see that experience being applicable in Texas, where groundwater is a private property right?
Well, I think it's still it's that interaction that where the question is. Where even though it is a private property right, I agree. When you're having a situation where groundwater is being pumped and it's under the influence of surface water, there's clearly the situation where that surface water element falls into that discharge from that pipe on that pump. And so even there's a mixture, the example I gave on the Rio Grande, 76% of the water we found was coming from the surface water. The remainder was groundwater. And so that's how we split the baby, so to speak, in regard to what was private ownership and what was state water. And so I think you have to go in and get that sort of data and information in order to be able to make that split. And I think the Western states, from my experience, even though they regulate both, they're looking at it from that standpoint as well, regulatorily, because the impacts are on the senior surface water right holders. That's who usually brings a complaint. And so the issue is how much of the water are they pumping is actual groundwater and how much of it is surface water. And so they get to the same issue. It's a splitting of the baby.
One other question did come in, and it actually, I think a few of you touched on it. It came in while you were making your final remarks, and maybe it's a good way to wrap it up, even if it's a little bit of a repeat. What role do or should GCDs play in trying to solve this conundrum?
I think they're a key. along with the other players in regard to the surface water side of the equation. I think they're key in relation to this.
Nailed it. All right, join me in thanking our panel. They did a great job.